Well, welcome back to the Wisdom Books. I'm struggling a minute with this book today because of spending the last week with Liz and her family. And we kind of talked about Job a bit. And this is Liz's sister, by the way, who I'm looking at and smiling. Why things weren't moving a little bit faster and why things weren't happening to relieve Liz of her pain on earth and to help the family get through that. There were many mornings in the middle of the night where we were all railing like, come on, God, what are you waiting for? Then we decided he and Liz were having some kind of negotiation and she wasn't doing very well, clearly, so we needed to move things along. One night I said something and Amy said, stop putting expectations on her like she had any control over this process. And I realized my expectations were on God. They weren't on Liz. Liz was ready to give up that fight. But as I prepared the lesson and as I thought about things, I realized that God wants us to trust in him. He knows what he's doing. I'd like to think I know how he could do it better, but he knows what he's doing. And if that lesson didn't hit home for me as I was finishing preparing this class today, I don't think it ever will. So thank you for your support of the Burr family. They're going to continue to need that through this week and beyond. But as we know that they've gained somebody pretty important in heaven who will continue to be working with us here. So let's get back to Job. Job's all about loss and suffering. He loses almost everything, well, not almost, everything he has that is dear to him. And he's given sores and pestilence and all kinds of things to endure. And it's hard to think about how we would respond in Job's circumstances. You okay? Okay. Can you think of the worst thing that you can imagine that could happen to you? What would that be? The worst thing that could happen to you. And maybe for some of you it's already happened.
I think losing everything and even your life in a fire, that's always been really hard for me to imagine fire.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. What's another way? What are some other worst thing scenarios?
To go along with what she said, my mom was a nurse, and as a child, we would say, what was the most painful thing you've seen in your patients? And she did say fire when they were burned. It was very, very painful. She knew. So
I can imagine that. So how do people respond to that loss and suffering? How have you observed people who have experienced loss respond to that?
It's always been amazing to me the resilience that people display. So often when they're going through things that it's hard to imagine going through, it often brings out the best in people. Not always, but often.
What else? How else have you observed people respond to loss?
Because of my interest in Hutchinson, I've looked at some of the things from the fire there, and just yesterday there was a couple who only survived by jumping into a pond, and it took them an hour to find each other in the pond. They lost everything, almost their life, and they're like, well, we're very thankful and we're going to rebuild. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah. I'd like to think I could be that way. I'd like to think. I've watched some people become very angry. Very, very, very angry. And lash out at everyone around them, everyone who thinks they're being helpful, that's another way we respond sometimes. It's hard to accept the pain, it's hard to deal with it, and so it's easier to push people away, to get angry, to not have to even talk about it or want to talk about it. And I think that's hard too, because that's a continuation of suffering that we all hate to see. None of us want to see suffering. I heard Terry say more than once, my whole life I've been trying to help people get better, and I can't do that now. So now I have to change my whole mindset and help Liz get to heaven. And that was a switch. That was a different way to have to think about things. So the worst thing that I can imagine, I think, has changed over time. I used to think the worst thing I could imagine was not having a date for the prom. And I did, but didn't like him. But anyway. Or the worst thing I could imagine was maybe getting fired from a job. That almost happened once. The worst thing that could happen would be losing someone I love, and I've experienced that more than 10 or 20 times, a couple times pretty poignantly. And yet we go on. We go on. So I think our whole sense of what suffering means to us and what loss means to us is probably a changing parameter. It's not going to be the same every day. We're going to look at it differently as we move through our life. Let's see if I can figure out how to make this work. How many times do you remember saying that in your lifetime? This just is not fair. When all my friends had dogs and I didn't, it was not fair. When all my friends had siblings and I didn't think that was fair. All my mom had to do was pack a black suitcase and go to the hospital and come home with a baby. And she just wasn't doing that. How many times as a parent have you said that? Life's just not fair. Doesn't work that way. It's not fair. As a teacher who then served on the Intercollegiate Athletic Association board at Wichita State and saw a budget, it didn't seem real fair that basketball coach was making about $1 bazillion more than I was. And I wasn't sure that his job was all that much more important than mine. After all, it was only a season. I had a whole semester. I think of the nurses and teachers and frontline workers, police, firemen, who are putting their lives on our line. And then I think of Major League Baseball, and I love Rick, but Major League Baseball and Doug and that guy, Keith. But I'm sorry. That was a lot of money to negotiate. But hasn't your reason for saying it's not fair changed over time? You say it's not fair about things a lot differently today than I think you probably did as a 5-year-old. And maybe that will continue. It's not fair that my knees don't like going upstairs because my bedrooms are all upstairs and I got to get there sooner or later. So the fairness of things change for us over time. But we all expect fairness from God, don't we? We all expect that He's going to be fair. He's going to use His power to protect us. He's going to keep hard things from happening to us. And He's going to do that fairly. If I'm good, He'll give me a life that's good. How many of us have thought that? And how many of us have slammed against that expectation a couple times? So fairness is a concept that we all think is important, and it is. I mean, we want to be treated fairly and justly in our endeavors. But the fairness comes from a different spot. And I think as we study Job today, we're going to get a little different sense of that. So you've seen in other Bible classes videos from the Bible Project. If you haven't seen the Bible Project, and I know we've been encouraged to do that as we've studied the Bible using their resources, they're a little kitschy in places. They're line drawings and funny guys talking. But I wanted to just give us an overview to Job, hopefully, by opening this. The book of Job really challenges our conception of suffering. We watch a lot of suffering and a lot of arguing and a lot of commentary on suffering in the book of Job. And we want answers. We want to know why God is doing this. Why is this happening? What's going on here? But we're not going to get that answer specifically. We're going to get an answer, but it may not be the answer to that particular question. And so perhaps the book of Job is asking us to reframe our questions within wisdom. And isn't that the topic we're talking about here? But to absorb the wisdom of the book of Job, we need to confront some of those assumptions that were mentioned, the ways we think about things, so that we can move on to a different way of thinking. So the first assumption is that if I'm godly, I won't have to suffer. If I'm godly, if I believe in God, if I'm a good and true and honest person, I shouldn't have to suffer. And our equation goes something like my good behavior and my spiritual intentions added to God's love and power is going to mean that I have a life in which everything will go really, really well for me. And boy, that sounds good. But Job's godliness and goodness didn't seem to help him at this moment in time. He was a prime candidate for the suffering that was about to occur. Let me take a step back for 1 second. In the project, they say Satan. Jay, anybody have any reason why they pronounced the Satan, the accuser? Have we just made that into Satan? This is my lack of Bible training here.
The translators have done that into the modern language, have done that. In most of the original writings, there is a proper pronoun attached to this word.
The Satan.
Yeah.
And Satan rather than Satan?
I'm sorry?
Satan rather than Satan?
Yeah, the Satan or the Satan. But the translators have left that word out. It's the same thing. They've done the same thing with Jehovah God. Jehovah God usually has a proper pronoun ahead of it. In the Greek, it's Hotheos, but they just say God or Lord.
We all learned something. So Satan has come to God in heaven to bring an accusation against him. He says, you're not worthy of being loved for yourself, other than the good gifts that you give to these people. That's the only reason they care about you. They think you're offering them protection and good living, but they really don't love you. And God responds by telling Satan to just kind of look down where he's going to find a man who will trust and love him no matter what happens. And then we've got this poor guy, Job, this good and blameless man, completely unaware of what's going on up above and what's going to happen in his life. And that caused me to think about, is there a conversation going on upstairs about me? Are they having some conversation about where I should go and how things should work for me and how that's going to happen? And my guess is they are. And that's a little worrisome. But I think we need to keep remembering that Job didn't know this conversation was happening. All of a sudden, his world just fell apart.
Well, if you're concerned about that, Julie, you might not want to be quite so good and blameless, and that way maybe they won't talk about you.
Thank you. I can work on that. And you haven't been around sometimes when I've been at a basketball game or some other places. But Job's reaction to this whole scenario is really the key to the story. Is Job going to reject God when trouble comes, or is he going to remain faithful no matter what happens? So somebody's got to win in this situation, right? There's this challenge. Satan says, people don't care about you except for what you do for them. God said, yeah, they do, and they'll remain loyal to me. So, what would be a win for Job? Kind of a weird question, but let's make it easier. What would be a win for God? Yeah, Job stays loyal. And what would be a win for Satan? Yeah, that he caves in. But what's the win for Job?
Job learned something that he has never known before. Now, how that affected the rest of his life, we don't know, because the Bible doesn't follow the rest of his life. But he learned something.
He clearly does. So the next assumption is that my suffering is only about me and where I am right at this moment in time. And it must have been really tempting for Job to say, whoa, I must have done something really pretty horrible for this to happen. Thought I was doing well. I thought I was being good and true. But something had to happen. But we have the advantage of knowing what Job does not, that there's this challenge going on, a bigger battle behind the scenes of his suffering. So Satan had this destructive purpose in mind. His goal was to destroy Job's trust in the God he loved. But God also had a purpose, and his purpose was to develop Job's trust while he gave Satan permission to harm Job. And that seems a little awkward too, doesn't it? But a couple things in that comment. God gave Satan permission to harm Job. What does that say about the relationship between God and Satan?
God's in control.
Yeah, God's in control. He's the one who has really the power. Satan thinks he does, would like to, and works very hard to try to take it. But God is the person in ultimate control. So if God gives permission for us to suffer, and we all have, that's probably the lesson that Jay says we all need to learn about putting our trust in God and recognizing that our life is really about more than just where we are sitting at this moment in time. I saw something on Facebook this morning. We may complain about the price of gas at the gas pump and the cost of food going up and travel being inaccessible. But think about someone who's sitting on a concrete floor in an airport hugging their child, not knowing where they will be next. And so the here and now for us is very different for each of us in the place that we are. But we need to know that God has more on his mind than just our momentary cares and concerns.
And that's really difficult for most people, for all of us, Julie. When we're in that kind of a situation, we draw ourselves into ourselves. We don't tend to look out at other people and other events and other things simply because we're in that situation.
Exactly.
It's hard to do. It's more than hard. It's very difficult to do, but we have to even at these times look out at the bigger picture, and that's a struggle.
It is a struggle. I've not had a major illness. I've not had a really major catastrophe in my life. I am blessed in so many ways. And it's hard to think that there are people around me who are in circumstances very different than mine. I'm reminded of that every Sunday morning when I come down 2nd Street to church and pass the homeless people congregated around Broadway and Topeka, thinking there must be something I could do here. And then I keep driving on to church. But God wants us to be a testament to his glory. He wants us to trust in him even when we don't have a clue what's going on and we can't explain the circumstances that we're in. We're asked to trust him. The third assumption is that suffering has to be a result of God punishing me for my sin. Now, Jay says I'm totally blameless, so I don't have to think about that, but Job's friends don't have the benefit of the behind-the-scenes challenge knowledge either. So they're saying to him, this has to be your fault, Job. I mean, you had to do something that brought this on to you. And they even suggest that his suffering is really probably not as great as he deserves. He's lost his home, his family, his wealth, his health. That's maybe not even enough, Job, because you must have done something really, really bad. So haven't we all thought of that at some point? Job says, no, I'm innocent. And he protests that throughout the book. But haven't we thought, oh, I must have done something to bring this on? Something had to happen here. Sometimes you wonder if God takes something away from us because we love it more than we love him. Or haven't we kind of waited for the other shoe to drop? Some things have happened and there must be something else worrying about those kinds of things. So I think we come by that assumption of, I must have done something here to make this suffering happen. The author of the book that we're working from says that our suffering is purposeful. It has a purpose. As a child of God, we can be confident that whenever we suffer, no matter the cause, God intends to use it to discipline us for good. Now, if I already believe I'm good, why do I need to be disciplined? But obviously that discipline doesn't feel good at the time. It feels pretty hard and harsh. But while it feels painful, it's purposeful. It's not punitive. It's not random. It's not too harsh. It's always out of love. It kind of calls to mind the concept of tough love, doesn't it? We know people need some support, some discipline, and we have to be able to provide that.
I have a question, Julie. I'm sorry to interrupt you all the time, but I have a
Please do.
question. When I see that, when I see that he disciplines us for a purpose and so on, that takes me right back to the idea that I must have done something wrong. But immediately before that, we've been talking about that's not necessarily the case. What is the discipline for? Why does that come about? Did I do something wrong that I'm disciplined now? And if I'm not doing anything wrong, why do I need the discipline? Or does discipline mean something different there than what I'm thinking of?
My guess is it means something different. Linda, you're nodding your head. Do you think it means
I
something different?
agree exactly
Yeah.
with what Jay's
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah.
The two things don't go together.
They don't. Because if we're blameless, we shouldn't have to be disciplined. But I've thought about that a lot this week. And I don't always put my trust in God first. And maybe that's what I'm being disciplined for.
Could you substitute maybe the word training? God is training us in some different direction, or trying
Pushed.
to move us in some different
Yeah.
direction? I don't know.
Yeah.
I've often thought about this, and I just don't know.
Yeah. Lori?
Well, I think about my kids, and I'm a kid for God. There were things and lessons I taught my kids, knowing that in the future they would have to deal with something. I wasn't necessarily disciplining them, but some of the ways I did things may have seemed like a discipline to them, so they would learn those lessons. And I think I see the same thing with God sometimes. I'm like, God, why are you putting me through this? And the only thing I can come up with is there's something going to happen in the future that he's trying to teach me how to deal with now. Because I'll look back at my life and there's lots of things that have happened to me that I've went through that have helped me later in life and other things.
Yeah. I think there's something to that as well, that there are lessons to be learned. Who else?
I looked up discipline and it says, the practice of training people to obey rules or a code of behavior, using punishment to correct disobedience. So I think the part about training us, maybe that part is more strong in this
Example,
context.
rather than the punishment part of it.
Yeah, the punishment part is
Yeah.
not there, but the training is there. and it's hard to receive training. It makes her muscles hurt and those kinds of things.
Exactly. Linda?
I guess I look at this a little differently. In Job's case, yes, we know the background that God allowed Satan to do that. As far as now and here and now, I view that we live in a fallen world, an evil world, and therefore God is going to allow the same things that He allows to everybody to affect us. And then our job, I guess, is to learn how to deal with that. And just from personal experience, reminding me daily who is in control. And it is not me. And we've heard that statement. But that is so true, because I think all of us think that we have control over our own lives, and we don't. And that, in the end, is what he wanted Job to understand, is you've got to trust me.
Yeah.
But I don't view it that God's up there saying, well, I need to do this to so-and-so and so-and-so. I think that's just a result of us
Yeah.
living in this world that is evil.
Yeah. I think we all give really good lip service to the phrase God is in control. We all believe it. We say it. I don't know that I live it as well as I could. And perhaps that's the training I'm to have, is to put my trust more fully in God.
I'd like to just add, God is so good and powerful, and He, the narrative up there talked about Him being infinite. We're finite. He's eternal. He's always been there. He had no beginning, and He has no end. We do. He's complete. We're incomplete in everything. And so I think Job does do a great job. He is us. He asks the questions. So, why is this happening? I followed you, Lord. I know I fall short. I know I'm not perfect, but, and we all tend to ask those questions. But I think it's good to ask those questions, because suffering is what makes us stop and think. When everything's going great and everything's going well, we tend to not stop and think as much. And so I think it is good to ask those questions, and you might learn something. And we do need to look introspectively and say, okay, what have I done to lead me to this point in my life? God, help me understand that. But then we also have to remember the big picture of, we do live in a fallen world. None of us are perfect. None of us. We all deserve suffering, really. But God is full of justice. He's infinitely just, but He's also infinitely merciful too.
Exactly.
And so I think it's good to stop and think and say, hey, why not me? Why shouldn't I lose everything? Christ Himself lost so much, but yet good came from it. And so I think, there's a scripture, I think it's in Deuteronomy, God is so good and powerful, He can even use evil for good. And so I think, suffering is a good tool to keep us focused on God and to have a deeper revelation of His glory, as it covers all things, goodness and evil. The theonomy question, God is so good and powerful, why is there evil in the world? And we all need to answer that, and we will answer that, because we're going to be exposed to it. And that's why a lot of people keeps them away from the Lord. Well, if your God's so good and powerful, why do babies and children get sexually molested? Whatever form that comes in, it's all the same question as what Job faced with. And I'm so thankful for the book of Job, because when suffering hits, it tells us exactly how we need to handle it. And it gives us permission to be honest with God and ask Him, why is this happening, Lord? And that's a good thing to do. It's what we should do. We shouldn't say, oh,
what's up with this God? Well, I'm going to turn away from him because look, I've done everything the Bible told me I need to be doing. Yeah, I'm not perfect, but that's why he died for me. So, I'm going to find a different religion. And Job didn't do that, even though his friends questioned it.
Yeah.
And we got to be careful too, when our friends and family go through hard times, to not say, well, what did you do? You must have done something. I mean, that's the spirit of we're good.
Yeah,
It's haughtiness instead of we all deserve what happens to Job.
exactly. We all need to hit that brick wall every once in a while to reframe our thinking. Well, the last assumption we're going to look at today is the belief that what I really need most from God is, first of all, relief from my suffering, and secondly, answers to my questions. Just tell me why this is happening, God, and maybe then I'll figure it out. So it seems reasonable that we would want to ask why, and Job did. But throughout his debates with his friends, Job keeps looking for answers. And how many of you have friends who've tried to give you answers to a dilemma you've had? Well, you should do this, or maybe you should try that, or maybe you should go there, or maybe you should, consider something else.
Now you're stepping on Job.
I know. And when my friends are helping me in that way, I want to say, do you not think I didn't think of that? Do you not think I didn't consider that or that or that or that? And I still have questions. So I think it's really easy to keep looking for answers. We're not satisfied with the simple answers. We're not satisfied with the, well, you should or you could. I just want it to go away and be answered. So Job listened to everybody's arguments, and he argued his case with them. I'm innocent. I love the Lord. I'm trying to be faithful. But he really wanted to argue his case with God. He really wanted to hear something from God about why this was going on for him. So God answers Job, not exactly how Job thought he might be answered, but rather than revealing all the answers to Job's questions, God revealed himself. Have you been with me when I created the stars and the rest of the universe? Have you been with me while I've watched things happening and created things to happen? So rather than telling God or Job what he thought he wanted to hear, he told him what he needed to hear. He told him what he needed to know about his God. God knew that Job needed to hear those things in order to move toward healing. And I think, be still and listen, we struggle with that sometimes too. God knew that the more Job understood about his character and his power and his purposes, the more Job could trust him in understanding why things were going on. So God really changed the course of the conversation. He reframed the way this conversation was going. So from moving us from demanding from God that he be fair and just, he was trying to move us to thanking him and being thankful for all that we've received that we really do not deserve. We deserve punishment, but we get forgiveness. We deserve rejection, but we experience powerful love. We deserve judgment, but we're showered with mercy. We deserve to die, but we are given unending life. In a perfectly fair world, which is what we think we want, there would be no need for this mercy and grace. So clearly that mercy and grace is important to us. So at the beginning of the story, we're feeling pretty sorry for Job, right? He's this unwitting victim in this challenge he knows nothing about. And then when we read his response after God revealed himself, we get a sense that God used that suffering in Job's life for some good purpose. Was it worth it? And can we look back on our own lives and say, I think this was worth it. I think I learned something. I think something important here happened. And gosh, I wish I didn't have to relearn it so many thousands of times.
Well, and it's like when God's glory is revealed on a deeper level to us, how can we not say that's worth it?
Exactly.
Jenny? Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think what made Job's suffering worth it was that it's a lesson for all the ages ever since it was recorded, and so obviously our suffering will probably not serve to that extent, but perhaps we're being a lesson for others in our life down the road that,
Exactly.
you know, as was stated, you have no idea, you don't understand all the context of that yet.
Right. And I guess we've all done what Job did, waver back and forth. Despair, confusion, hope, clarity. We wiggle back and forth in those places. But I think we all can see how that has played out, at least for ourselves, as we've experienced suffering, and will continue to do so. It's not a one-time event. One time, one lesson fits all event. We're going to suffer for other things and other reasons to move forward. So next week we're going into the Psalms. We're going to spend 4 weeks in the Psalms. And I've put some study questions at the end, so some verses to look up and some things to think about. Thank you so much for your discussion with me today. I learned a lot for myself in preparing this lesson, and I hope it's caused you to think about some things as well. So thank you.